What if I told you there is more to the story about Vladimir Putin? What if I told you that Vladimir Putin's actions today are the direct result of some of the worst foreign policy mistakes made by the US government? I know these are bold statements to make, and before you write me off and dismiss this video, I want you to understand the angle I'm coming from. For the past decade, Russia and Ukraine have been engaged in a devastating conflict that has destabilized Europe and brought tremendous instability to the world. But Putin didn't just appear out of thin air. He has been at the top of the Russian government for nearly a quarter of a century, but the majority of people have yet to hear the full story of how the US government treated Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union and how US foreign policy created the perfect conditions for a political leader like Vladimir Putin to rise up into power. The West loves to portray Russia, and specifically Putin, as one of America's greatest enemies. But here's the twist. Did you know that Russia was actually desperate to be integrated into the West? Just listen to this clip from Vladimir Posner, a French-born Russian-American journalist.
Soon after the Soviet Union ceased to exist, Yeltsin came to the United States, and he addressed a joint session of Congress. And he said, the people of Russia are offering their hand to the people of the United States in friendship to build a better world, a world without war, a world without peace. And this was exactly what the vast majority of Russians wanted. And I would even say that today, the vast majority of Russians would like to have, if not a friendship with the United States, at least a partnership.
You see, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States government faced a difficult decision. How was it going to treat this new entity called Russia? The United States had two very clear options. The first was to treat Russia the same way it treated former enemies Germany and Italy after World War II. After the war, Europe was in complete shambles and desperately needed direct foreign investment to rebuild the continent. The US government saw an opportunity to bring Europe into its sphere of influence and pledge billions of dollars to rebuild all of Europe. This plan was called the Marshall Plan and paved the way to the better governments, better infrastructure, and the Europe we all know today. The second option was to continue treating Russia as the enemy, never forgive them for their actions during the Cold War, and treat them as an inferior state that should never be integrated into Western society. Once again, Vladimir Posner reveals which option the US government chose.
And basically, that view was the one that was accepted. It was the one that was accepted. And the attitude towards Russia was pretty much, you're no longer a superpower. You are a second-rate country. Just keep quiet, please.
Now let's fast forward to early 2000, when Vladimir Putin emerged as Russia's new leader. Putin's very first move as president was to ask for Russia's entry into NATO, which actually makes perfect sense. NATO was created to combat the rise of the Soviet Union, but at this point, the Soviet Union had already been disbanded for over 9 years. So why couldn't Russia join NATO now and contribute to combating any future threats? Putin's proposal was immediately dismissed, with the implication that Russia was irrelevant. Not deterred, Putin tried a different route. If the US wasn't going to let Russia join NATO, then what about integrating into the West through membership into the European Union? Once again, Putin was rejected. This time, he was told that Russia was too big and would hold too much influence in the bloc. Two missed opportunities and two major events that heavily influenced the direction Vladimir Putin and Russia would develop in the coming years. Just imagine how different our world would look like today if Russia was a leading EU member alongside Germany, integrated into NATO, and fostering an alliance with the United States so strong that NATO itself would no longer have any reason to exist. That world was possible, but instead, the United States chose to alienate, isolate, and provoke Russia, ultimately leading us to the situation we face today. One of the terms we often hear from US politicians is the international rules-based order. It is a narrative that frames the West as the upholders of international law, democracy, and the principles set forth by organizations like the United Nations. For a clear example of what I mean, just look at this tweet sent from Secretary of State Antony Blinken. "We stand with all human rights defenders who fight against repression and advocate for fundamental freedoms. The US and our partners will continue to work toward a world in which all nations uphold and strive towards the principle that human rights belong to everyone, everywhere." It's an excellent message, except for one problem. The US government is one of the largest violators of human rights in the world, and with the rise of social media, the cracks in this narrative are becoming impossible to ignore. While the United States is quick to slam Vladimir Putin as a war criminal and condemn his actions in Ukraine, US politicians simultaneously support Benjamin Netanyahu and send billions of dollars worth of weapons to carry out death and destruction across the Middle East. The hypocrisy of the United States stance between the wars in Ukraine and Gaza is shocking. Just watch this clip to see firsthand how the US government justifies war actions in Gaza, but then turns around and condemns the same actions in Ukraine.
Being honest about the fact that there have been civilian casualties and that there likely will be more is being honest, because that's what war is. It's brutal, it's ugly, it's messy. I've said that before. The president also said that yesterday. Doesn't mean we have to like it. It's hard to look at what he's doing in Ukraine, what his forces are doing in Ukraine, and think that any ethical, moral individual could justify that. It's difficult to look at the It's difficult to look at some of the images and imagine that any well-thinking, serious, mature leader would do that.
Spare us the fake tears. The message sent to the world is clear. To the US government, Ukrainian lives are worth more than their Palestinian counterparts. The world sees this double standard, and it's why the majority of the developing world has lost faith in this rules-based order. But at a time when democracies in the United States and Europe are both facing crises of legitimacy and power, Putin has become the perfect scapegoat. David Wearing's 2019 article, entitled How the West Helped to Make Putin, says it perfectly. The antagonist of the hour is Vladimir Putin, a character who represents everything the West is not. Authoritarian rather than democratic, thuggish rather than humanitarian, and a threat to rather than an upholder of the liberal international order led since World War II by the US. Moreover, at a time when Western power, perhaps even the West itself, is undergoing a period of crisis, Putin is the culprit, the mischief maker, subverting our democracies and dragging us beneath our usual impeccable standards. What's incredible here is that this article was written in 2019. But fast forward to today, and these statements still remain true. By crafting this simplistic narrative of the West versus Putin's Russia, our politicians frame one side as inherently good and the other as inherently bad. This ignores the role the West played in creating these conditions. Don't forget what I said earlier. The US had two options on how to treat Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. They chose option number 2, and with it came undeniable chaos for the common citizens of Russia. Let's break it down. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, the United States sent in advisors and diplomats to help shape Russia's transition to a market economy. They imposed what they called an economic liberalization program. The United States wanted to shift Russia from communism to free market capitalism. They did exactly that, but prioritized Western financial interests at the expense of Russian stability. State-owned industries were privatized at bargain prices and sold to a small group of wealthy, well-connected Russians. This process created the oligarch class, who ruled Russia in the 1990s under a corrupt system of crony capitalism. And this is where the United States missed the mark completely. If the US helped Russia integrate into Western society, Russia would look very different today. But the West took advantage of a weak Russia, and here is what happened to the majority of Russian citizens. At the recommendation of the International Monetary Fund, public spending on health, education, pensions, and welfare were slashed by 50%. Food prices tripled almost overnight, and in just 7 years, the number of Russians living on less than $4 a day skyrocketed from 2 million to 60 million. Male life expectancy dropped by 5 years, and violent crime surged. All of this resulted in Russia's economy collapsing by more than 50% from 1990 to 1998. The West's actions didn't just fail. They devastated Russia. Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz later compared the economic destruction of the 1990s to the devastation Russia experienced during World War II. This was a far cry from what Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, had envisioned for the country. Gorbachev had hoped for a transition to a Nordic-style social democracy, a mixed economy with strong public services, high taxes, and a government accountable to parliament rather than an authoritarian strongman. Instead of looking like something like Sweden or Finland, the West created a country ravaged by violence and corruption with very little economic prospects for the future. And this is exactly how Vladimir Putin came to power. When Putin began his rule as president, the first thing he did was crack down on the oligarchs. He didn't dismantle the system the West had built, he rebalanced it. Power shifted from the billionaire class to the state, with Putin firmly in control. Cronyism didn't disappear, it was just placed under his authority. After the chaos of the 1990s, Russian citizens saw this as a relief. Once again, let's look at this chart showing Russia's GDP growth, and we can see how Russia's economy entered a new phase of economic growth under Putin during this stage 2 period of growth from 1999 to 2012. When people in the West expressed confusion about Putin's popularity or why so many Russians reject the liberal international order? The answer is simple. Russians remember the chaos of the 1990s. They know the West played a large role in the economic crisis, but also remember who was the leader who pulled them out of it. Now, let's talk about NATO. Western leaders want you to believe that NATO's expansion was a defensive response to an aggressive Russia, a country supposedly desperate to recreate the former Soviet Union by expanding westward into Europe. But this narrative falls apart under scrutiny. The reality is that Russia did nothing to provoke NATO or the West. NATO's expansion began when Russia, under Boris Yeltsin, was at its weakest, economically devastated, and practically a vassal to Washington. At that point, Russia was hardly a threat to anyone. The aim of NATO's expansion wasn't defense. It was to ensure that Russia would never regain its power or influence. And once again, Vladimir Posner reveals the truth.
Take the time from when Gorbachev came to power, March 1985, to 2007, when Putin has been in power for 7 years. That's 22 years. I ask you to find a single thing in foreign or domestic policies done by the Soviet Union while it still existed, and then Russia proper, that might in any way anger, irk, disappoint the United States. Let me answer that for you. Nothing. Not one thing during that period. Now, what did Russia get as a result of that? First, the enlargement of NATO.
Hey, before I go on, I want to explain a little bit more about my creative process and how I write scripts for the videos on this channel. The process takes a long time, often involving many hours and days of research and writing. And a tool I've been using a lot lately is Ground News, who has been a longtime sponsor and helps make this channel possible. As you can imagine, I'm constantly checking Ground News for the latest updates to the situation in Ukraine, and you can too at ground.news/Cyrus. Earlier this week, one of Russia's top generals, who oversees the nuclear weapons, was assassinated in Moscow with a scooter bomb from the Ukrainian government. We can see that over 750 articles have reported on this story, with over 75% of these being highly factual. This is a rating based on how subjective their printed reporting is and the timeliness of their corrections. Easily, my favorite feature about Ground News is this ability to compare the different news outlets that are covering the story from around the whole world. For example, the Kyiv Post out of Ukraine is proudly showing a graphic video from a dash cam that captures the exact moment of the explosion that killed the Russian general, while the Evening Standard out of the UK is reporting that Putin will take spectacular revenge for assassination of a Russian general in Moscow bomb attack. Ground News helps me understand a story better by seeing the competing narratives that different outlets use to cover that story. So if you are someone that values critical thinking and trying to make sense of the many stories coming out of the world, this is a great tool for you. And lucky for you, they're giving viewers of my channel 50% off the Unlimited Access Vantage plan, which is the same access I use for my research. Whether you subscribe or send it as a gift, all in, it's less than $5 a month, which for good analysis and news is pretty cheap. This discount is their biggest sale of the year, and you can access it at ground.news/Cyrus or by scanning the QR code on screen. And with that, now back to our story of Vladimir Putin and Russia. As you can see, Russia made every effort to appease the West, hoping to build a partnership. And what did they get in return? An existential military threat placed right on their doorstep. If you want an extensive analysis on how aggressively expanding NATO led to this war in Ukraine, I did a full breakdown on this in another video, which I'll link at the end of today's presentation. But the West narrative about Putin as a lone villain and threat to democracy conveniently omits its own role in creating the very circumstances that led to his rise. And let's be clear, this isn't about excusing Putin's actions. It's about understanding them in the broader context. The chaos of the 1990s didn't just happen. It was the direct result of Western intervention. And when the Russian people saw no other option, they turned to someone who promised stability, strength, and a way out of the mess the West had left behind. The policies that devastated Russia's economy, created the oligarch class, and expanded NATO's reach to Russia's borders were not accidental. They were deliberate. They were designed to sideline Russia to prevent it from ever being a global power again. And yet, these very actions paved the way for Putin's rise and his enduring popularity at home. The lessons from this are clear. If the West wants to understand the dynamics at play in Russia and Ukraine today, it needs to start by looking at its own history. Ignoring this history won't erase it, and pretending Putin's rise was inevitable only ensures that the same mistakes will be repeated elsewhere. The narrative of the West versus Putin may make for good headlines, but it does nothing to address the deeper causes of this conflict. The question we should be asking is not just how Putin came to power, but how the choices made by the United States and Europe help create him. Until those questions are answered, the cycle of alienation, provocation, and conflict will continue. Everyone, I want to thank you for making it to this point of today's video. And if you want to learn more about the history of how the United States created Vladimir Putin, I'll include a link to the full speech from Vladimir Posner's speech at Yale University, which was the inspiration for today's video. Once again, I want to thank Ground News for sponsoring today's video about Russia. And if you want to see a more in-depth analysis about how aggressively expanding NATO led to this war in Ukraine, click here to watch a full breakdown. As always, I want to thank you for your support, and I look forward to seeing you all in our next video soon.